The rain was already falling when Clara Whitmore arrived at the inn that had somehow become hers. It stood like a memory against the grey sea cliffs, tall, weather-beaten, with white shutters that rattled in the wind and ivy that had curled possessively around the porch beams. The Seafarer's Rest had belonged to her great-aunt Mabel, a quiet woman Clara had only met twice in her life, both times during childhood summers blurred by salt air and strawberry ice cream. The will had come unexpectedly, wrapped in thick cream-colored paper, naming Clara as the sole heir to the property, with a single line penned in ink. "The past sleeps in room 217. Let it wake gently." Clara hadn't understood the message at the time and had nearly dismissed the inheritance entirely. She lived in the city, worked in digital marketing, and had no plans of becoming a seaside innkeeper. But something about the phrasing lingered in her mind. And after her recent breakup and a promotion she'd walked away from, the idea of an escape had become magnetic. Now, standing before the inn's heavy oak door, keys in hand, she felt both like an intruder and a returning ghost. The inside of the inn smelled of lavender and old books, with polished wood floors and dust motes floating through rays of dim coastal light. It wasn't abandoned, far from it. Everything was in perfect order, preserved as though someone had just stepped out for a moment and would be returning shortly. Clara wandered through the halls, brushing her fingers across the banister of the main staircase, admiring the antique sconces and framed nautical maps lining the walls. Each room she passed on the second floor bore a brass number plate. Room 202, room 204. And then there was room 217. The door was different, painted a deep ocean blue, unlike the others, and there was a faint shimmer in the air around it, like heat on pavement. Clara tried the knob. It didn't turn. She checked the ring of keys she'd been given, but none fit the lock. Frowning, she continued exploring the rest of the house, but her mind kept circling back to 217. That night, she slept in room 210, wrapped in one of Mabel's patchwork quilts, the sea's distant roar pulsing through the walls. She dreamed vividly. Images of the inn bustling with guests, laughter echoing in the parlor, candles flickering in every window, and a man's voice calling her name. When she woke, the name was gone from her memory, but her skin tingled with the sense of having been watched. The second day brought storms, wind slamming against the windows like fists. Clara busied herself with the contents of the downstairs study, finding boxes of old letters, guest logs, and a binder filled with maintenance requests. Inside a leather-bound journal belonging to Mabel, she found a folded note tucked into the pages. It read, "Only when you're ready to look at yourself will the door open." Underneath was a single line, "Room 217 was never empty." Curiosity became a hum under her skin. She stood before the blue door again that evening, pressing her palm flat against it. Felt warm. That night, her dreams deepened. This time she saw herself standing in room 217, though everything was reversed. The furniture on the wrong side, her reflection in the mirror turning away from her. A voice whispered, "You left him behind." Clara jolted awake, sweat cooling against her skin, the ocean murmuring in the dark like an unfinished sentence. The next morning she went back to the door. This time without keys, without force, she simply turned the knob. Clicked open. The room was dimly lit by a cloud-veiled sun, the air heavy with the scent of roses and something older, like candle wax and memory. Everything inside looked untouched. A four-poster bed, a desk beneath a lace-covered window, and a large ornate mirror standing opposite the foot of the bed. The moment she stepped over the threshold, the air shifted. She stared at the mirror. For a brief second, the reflection showed her, but with a different hairstyle, different clothes, and a smile she didn't remember ever wearing. Then it flickered, and the image snapped back to her present self. Clara blinked, heart racing, but the mirror remained still. A trick of the light, she told herself. A relic of grief, of change, of too much caffeine and too little sleep. But something deep inside her whispered that this room had been waiting. Not just for her, but for the version of her who had once stood in that mirror. The one she didn't remember. Or perhaps, the one she'd chosen to forget. Either way, room 217 had woken. And so had the past. Clara didn't return to room 217 the next day. Not because she wasn't curious, but because something in her gut told her not to rush. It wasn't fear exactly. It was a kind of reverence, like the hush that falls over church when someone strikes a single note on the organ. She spent the morning wandering through the cliffside gardens, the salty wind tousling her hair, the gulls crying above like messengers of something just out of reach. She thought of the mirror, not as furniture but as a presence. It had reflected her, yes, but not her as she was. There had been warmth in the room, a strange gravity, and for one breathless second, Clara had felt the certainty that the woman in the glass had been watching her back. That day, she avoided the second floor altogether. She cooked herself a simple dinner and read from Mabel's journal by firelight, noting with fascination the entries about room 217. "It only shows what you buried," one page read. "But don't dig too deep if you aren't ready to bleed." On the third morning she returned. Room 217 stood silent, the door now unlocked and inviting. Clara stepped inside with slow purpose, barefoot, the wood cool against her skin. The mirror loomed at the far wall, tall, arched at the top, framed in dark walnut carved with symbols she didn't recognize. Ivy and sea serpents intertwined above the crest. She approached it cautiously, watching her reflection appear. But it wasn't alone. Behind her in the glass, but not in the room, stood a man. Dark-haired, barefoot, shirt sleeves rolled up. He wasn't looking at her but rather into the distance, as though waiting for someone. Clara whirled around, heart in her throat. The room was empty, her reflection now normal. Her breath came in sharp pulls, panic rising like a tide. But the strange thing wasn't that he'd appeared. It was that she recognized him. Not from her waking life, but from a dream. He had been there, calling her name through fog, reaching for her as she turned away. She pressed her fingers to the glass. It was warm again. Not like sunlight or fire but like breath. Like life. That night she dreamed of him again. But this time they were standing beside each other, overlooking the sea, his hand brushing hers. "Why did you leave?" he asked. "I waited." Clara woke with his voice still echoing in her ears. She didn't remember his name, but she remembered the feeling, a depth of longing that made her chest ache. The next day, she returned to the mirror with a notepad. She began documenting everything: time of day, lighting, changes in the reflection. The mirror responded most vividly in the early morning and just before dusk. It didn't always show the man. Sometimes it showed her in a different outfit, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying, sometimes painting on a balcony she didn't recognize. One morning, it showed her in a wedding dress, lace sleeves, wind-tossed veil. Her eyes filled with tears of joy as the man stepped into view and kissed her forehead. Clara stared at that version of herself for nearly an hour. The pain that bloomed in her chest wasn't jealousy. It was grief. It was the kind of grief you feel when you stumble across an old letter from someone you once loved and realize what you lost wasn't them. It was who you were when they loved you. That day, she searched through her own old journals, trying to place the man. She remembered dating someone years ago, a writer named Theo, but that had ended and she was sure this man wasn't him. Then she found it. An old photo stuffed in the back of a drawer. A Polaroid of her at 19, at an art retreat by the sea. Standing beside her was the man, laughing. His name scrawled in blue ink across the bottom. Julian. The memory hit like a thunderclap. Julian. The boy she'd met that summer. The one she'd kissed once on a rainy night and never seen again. The one who had written her letters for months after. Letters she had never opened because she had returned to college and buried that summer under deadlines and a fear of feeling too much. She never replied. Never even read them. The shame washed over her in a cold wave. The mirror had shown her what could have been, if she had chosen him. If she had stayed. If she had been brave. The mirror didn't judge. Simply showed. As the days passed, Clara became obsessed. She moved into room 217. She rearranged her schedule to watch the mirror at certain times, waiting for glimpses of the alternate life. She watched herself kiss Julian in the morning sun, walk hand in hand through a gallery, whisper secrets over candlelit dinners. Her current life, her friends, her job, her city began to feel hollow, forgotten, dusty like the unused rooms of the inn. She found herself asking dangerous questions. What if the mirror was more than reflection? What if it was a window? What if she could cross over? And the most dangerous question of all, what if she already had? Clara began to lose track of time. Days drifted past like sea mist, soft-edged and slippery. The calendar on the wall remained unchanged. Her phone, barely touched, blinked with unanswered texts from coworkers, friends, and her landlord back in the city. But none of it felt urgent. Not when room 217 had become a world unto itself, a quiet sanctuary pulsing with something both ancient and intimate. The mirror was no longer a curiosity. It was a presence. And Clara had stopped pretending she didn't believe in its power. Every morning, she woke before dawn, pulled the heavy curtains aside, and waited for the light to filter through the glass in just the right way. That's when the mirror would stir, revealing scenes more vivid than dreams. Not just her and Julian, but a whole life built around them. The mirror didn't just show fragments anymore. It showed continuity. A life that had unfolded naturally from that long-ago summer, if only she'd had the courage to answer his letters. In that other life, Clara and Julian had bought a small cottage not far from the inn. She taught art classes at the local community center. He wrote poetry. Terrible poetry, she thought with a fond smile, but it didn't matter because he read it to her over coffee every morning. They had a dog, a large and lazy sheepdog named Bram. They hosted weekend dinners with neighbors and went for long walks along the cliffs at sunset. It wasn't a life of luxury or acclaim, but it was real, tangible, tender. And slowly, it began to eclipse the life she actually lived. One morning, the mirror showed her in a gallery, standing proudly beside a painting she'd created. A stormy seascape that made her fingers tingle with déjà vu. She hadn't painted in years. But in the mirror she never stopped. Julian stood beside her, his arm around her waist, whispering something in her ear that made her laugh. Clara found herself mimicking the movement she saw, writing down snippets of Julian's poetry, sketching the outlines of the cottage she saw in the background, trying to memorize the way her mirror self smiled. The more she watched, the more the images bled into her waking thoughts. She would make tea and set 2 cups on the table before remembering she was alone. She began humming a melody from a dream she couldn't name. One evening, she found herself at the edge of the garden, whispering his name to the wind as if he might answer. The next morning he did. He appeared in the mirror with startling clarity, closer than ever before. His gaze met hers through the glass. "You're still here," he said softly. Clara froze. His voice, clear, warm, undeniably real, didn't echo like a memory. Felt alive. "I've been waiting," he continued. "I thought maybe you'd forgotten." She stepped closer to the glass, barely breathing. "Julian," she whispered. He smiled, and something in her chest shattered open. "You left," he said, not accusing, not angry, just stating the truth. "But we don't have to stay apart." The days that followed were filled with blurred lines. Clara began to speak to him regularly. At first only at dawn, but then again at dusk. He answered. Always gently. Always patiently. He remembered things she didn't. Places they went in the mirror life. Inside jokes she couldn't recall but laughed at anyway. "You were happy here," he told her. "We were happy." She wanted to believe it. She began sleeping in the room more than ever, sketching her own memories beside the images in the glass. Some nights, she saw versions of herself rocking a baby in a chair by the fireplace. Some nights she saw Julian waiting by the garden gate with flowers in hand. But then came the visions she didn't understand. Glitches in the mirror's grace. One evening, she watched as the mirror Clara stood crying alone at the window. Julian gone, the sea storming outside. Another day, she saw herself walking through a funeral procession. The casket was closed. These cracks in the mirror's fantasy haunted her. What happened? She asked the reflection. But Julian wouldn't answer. Not yet, he said. Not until you come back. It wasn't just a window anymore. It was an invitation. The mirror pulsed with something more than memory now. It pulled at her like gravity, like fate. She began to lose interest in the outside world. The inn's phone rang one afternoon, and she didn't even flinch. The groceries she'd bought at the village market sat wilting on the kitchen counter. She found herself rereading Mabel's notes with new intensity, looking for patterns, rituals, instructions. Mabel had written, "The mirror doesn't lie. But it doesn't tell the whole truth either." Another entry said, "Love is not enough. Be careful what version of yourself you choose to keep." Still, Clara couldn't let go. The other life was beautiful. It was hers, almost. And with each passing day, the difference between almost and real felt like a gap she could step across. She began to dream of Julian even without the mirror. Sometimes she woke with his name on her lips. Sometimes she felt his hand brushing hers. One night, she touched the mirror's surface and felt it ripple. It was no longer glass. It was water. It was a door. And soon it would open. The moment Clara felt the mirror ripple beneath her fingertips, the world as she knew it began to tilt. It didn't happen all at once. There was no grand rupture or thunderous split, but rather a slow, delicate seepage like ink spreading through parchment. Reality, once firm beneath her feet, became porous. She would be in the kitchen boiling water for tea and suddenly smell lilacs, the scent Julian used to tuck into her pillowcase in the mirror life. She would reach for a teacup and find it moved from where she'd placed it, just as it always was in the reflection. Once she walked past the hallway mirror and glimpsed herself wearing a dress she didn't own, a soft yellow thing with lace at the collar, and behind her the cottage from the mirror, sunlight dancing off the painted windowsills. At first, Clara dismissed these moments as tricks of light, tricks of memory, tricks of a grieving mind. But denial became impossible when the impossible began to leave traces. Her hand once came away from the glass with a shimmer of moisture, though the mirror had not steamed. A strand of hair she found on her pillow matched the color and curl of the woman she saw in the mirror. Not her current self, but the other version. And then one morning she woke with sand on her feet. She tried to test the boundaries. She moved objects in room 217, placed a flower on the desk, drew a sigil on the wall with charcoal, turned the rug slightly askew. The next day, those changes would appear in the mirror life too. Julian noticed. "I see you," he said with a crooked smile. "You're closer now." And he was right. The line between the two versions of herself had begun to dissolve. When she touched the glass, she no longer felt surface resistance. She felt warmth, yield, pulse like a second heartbeat. The barrier was thinning. Clara began to drift through her days, unsure which world she belonged to. Sometimes she'd open a drawer in the kitchen and find items that belonged in the mirror. Recipes written in Julian's looping script, postcards from places she had never been but remembered visiting. The cottage key from the reflection appeared on her nightstand. The dog's leash hung by the door. She laughed nervously at first, unsure if she was losing her mind or gaining another. Then came the day the mirror changed without her. She entered room 217 to find the reflection already alive mid-scene. Herself and Julian arguing in a kitchen she had never seen before, voices raised, pain in every glance. "You never read my letters," the mirror Julian shouted. "You never even gave me the chance to be part of your life." Mirror Clara stood frozen, guilt twisting her face. Clara turned from the mirror, shaken. But when she looked back again, the scene had already shifted. To a quiet dinner, the tension dissolved, their hands clasped across a candlelit table. The mirror wasn't just showing possibilities anymore. It was showing a narrative, a life with conflicts and joy and heartbreak. A life with consequences. A life that moved forward with or without her. The realization hit her with a kind of quiet horror. The more she watched, the more the mirror life continued to evolve. As if it didn't need her consent anymore. That night, she began to feel the bleed in her body. Her reflection in the bathroom flickered, showing bruises on her wrist she didn't remember getting. She found a faint scar beneath her ribs, one she'd never had. When she opened her closet, half her wardrobe now looked like it belonged to someone else. Softer fabrics, looser fits, bohemian prints. Julian's handwriting had begun to appear in her notebooks, tucked between her thoughts like leaves pressed between pages. Once, she caught her reflection smiling when she wasn't. It unnerved her. Was she still in control? Was she still herself? Patricia, the local baker who ran a cafe down the road, noticed the change. "You all right, Clara?" she asked gently. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Clara didn't answer. She didn't know how to explain that she had become the ghost, caught between lives, between choices, between versions of herself. She returned to room 217 more obsessively now, searching for answers in the mirror's depths. Julian seemed different too. More urgent, more real. "You're almost through," he whispered one morning. "Just a little further, and we can be whole again." She touched the mirror, and for the first time, felt her fingers sink ever so slightly through the surface. Outside, the inn had begun to mirror the change as well. Guests no longer came. Mail stopped arriving. The world narrowed to a corridor of memory and glass. Birds avoided the roof. The sea grew louder. Room 217's air thickened, pulsing with possibility and danger. Mabel's journal pages began appearing in places Clara hadn't left them. One now sat on her desk in room 217 with a new warning scrawled in red ink. "The mirror does not give. Takes. Always takes." But Clara ignored it. She was so close. So close to something she couldn't name but desperately needed. Julian's face lingered in her dreams like a promise. And when she opened her eyes each morning, she wasn't sure which world she had woken into. Then one night it happened. The mirror glowed faintly in the moonlight, its surface rippling like water in a stone basin. Julian stood within it, arms outstretched. "Come home," he whispered. And Clara stepped forward. Not touching, not watching, but moving. Through. The glass accepted her without resistance. The air behind it smelled like rosemary and sea salt and old paper. For one breathtaking moment, she was both versions of herself, young and older, hopeful and haunted, brave and afraid. She blinked, and when she opened her eyes, she was no longer in room 217. She was inside the mirror. The air on the other side of the mirror was different, thicker, sweeter, and strangely quiet. Not silent exactly, but absent of the low hum of electricity, the buzz of the refrigerator back at the inn, the creak of old pipes in the walls. Clara stood barefoot on worn wooden floorboards, bathed in the soft glow of morning light streaming through gauzy curtains. The room was almost identical to room 217 in layout, but warmer, filled with life. Fresh-cut flowers rested in a vase on the desk. A silk scarf, hers yet not hers, hung on the back of a chair. A steaming cup of tea sat on the nightstand beside a half-read book she didn't recognize. And there was Julian standing in the doorway, barefoot and smiling, his eyes brimming with something between joy and disbelief. "You made it," he whispered, his voice cracking. Clara nodded, words stuck in her throat. She reached out and touched his arm. He was solid, warm, real. She hadn't realized until that moment how much she had feared this was all just illusion. He pulled her into an embrace, and for a moment, time folded in on itself. The weight of everything, of choices, of regrets, of years lost, melted into the space between heartbeats. They didn't speak much that first day. There was no need. Julian led her through the cottage, hers and his together. The walls were painted soft earth tones, shelves lined with books and candles. A watercolor of the seaside cliffs hung in the hallway, signed with her own name in a signature she hadn't used in years. Her studio was at the back of the house, filled with canvases, some unfinished, some completed. She wandered through them in awe, recognizing pieces she had never painted, but somehow still remembered. In this life, she hadn't stopped creating. In this life, she had leaned in instead of walking away. The days that followed passed in a surreal peace. They cooked together, laughed together, even argued gently about where to plant the new rosemary bush outside. At night, Julian read aloud from the poems she had forgotten he wrote. And when they made love, it wasn't like something rediscovered. It was like something remembered. But beneath the warmth, something strange simmered. Clara began to notice small inconsistencies. She never saw the neighbors Julian spoke of. Letters arrived in the mail, but they bore no postage. The clocks didn't seem to keep time. She would glance at 1 in the morning, and it would still read 17 hours later. She never felt hungry, but meals were always waiting. Birds perched on windowsills but never sang. And the mirror, the one that should have shown her reflection, was gone. She asked Julian once, casually, if he'd seen it. He stiffened. "What mirror?" She brushed it off. But the more time passed, the more Clara felt the boundaries of the world tightening. She walked the path toward the village, only to find it looped her back to the house. She tried writing letters, but the ink faded as soon as it dried. When she painted new things she hadn't seen in the mirror life, the colors warped or bled until the image distorted into static. Julian remained sweet, loving, attentive, but slightly off. He never spoke about the past in detail. When she asked about that summer at the retreat, he would smile and say, "We found each other. That's all that matters." She agreed, but her stomach twisted. One night, she woke in a cold sweat, sure she had heard someone calling her name. She ran to the front door and opened it, but outside was darkness. Not night. Darkness. Absolute, unnatural black. And in it, a reflection of herself standing behind the glass, in room 217, staring back. Clara gasped and stepped away. The door slammed shut behind her. She told Julian about it the next morning. He cupped her face gently and kissed her forehead. "There's nothing out there," he said. "Just us. Isn't that enough?" She wanted it to be. God, she wanted it to be. But the painter in her knew. Even in the most beautiful scenes, shadows matter. And this world had none. No weather. No mess. No questions. No choices. One day she found the studio locked. Julian had never locked it before. She searched the house but found no key. That night, she slipped from bed and returned to the front door. Again darkness. Again her reflection. Only this time it reached out as if knocking. Behind it, room 217 glowed with candlelight. Clara whispered, "What is this place?" Her reflection mouthed the words back. "You're trapped." She turned, heart pounding, and Julian stood behind her, face soft with sadness. "You're remembering, aren't you?" he said. You weren't supposed to. He didn't sound angry. Just tired. And then it all came flooding back. The warnings in Mabel's journal. The fractured reflections. The life too perfect to be real. Clara looked around and saw the trap for what it was. Not a dream, not a fantasy, but a pocket reality, spun from memory and longing and regret. The mirror hadn't opened a door. Had closed one. Julian stepped closer. You don't have to go, he said. We could still have this. Just say yes. Say you'll stay. She searched his face for malice, for manipulation, but found only heartbreak. Because maybe he wasn't real. Or maybe he was a piece of her left behind, given form. Either way, this world was built on silence. And she had more to say. She stepped back from the door, turned to him and whispered, I'm sorry. I can't stay in a life that doesn't move forward. Julian nodded once, slowly, as though he had been waiting all along for her to realize it. He kissed her hand, stepped back into the dark, and vanished. The walls of the cottage began to flicker. Paintings peeled. Light fractured. The floor crumbled into stars. And through the blur of unraveling memory, Clara saw it again. Room 217. The mirror reappearing like a portal in reverse. Ran. Dive. The glass split like water, and she was through. She collapsed onto the hardwood floor, gasping, sobbing, real air in her lungs, real pain in her knees. The inn around her was cold, dusty, quiet. But it was real. And so was she. Clara lay on the floor of room 217 for what felt like hours. The cool wood grounding her in a way no dream or memory ever could. Her breath came ragged, her palms raw from where they had struck the ground on impact. The mirror stood before her again, still and solid, its surface once more just glass, revealing only her reflection, disheveled and tear-streaked. The world she had just left shimmered faintly within her mind, like the lingering taste of honey or the echo of a song half forgotten. But the details were already slipping away. She remembered Julian's voice, the touch of his hand, the smell of rosemary from the garden. But the rooms of the cottage had blurred, and the paintings on the walls felt as though they'd been created by someone else. The trap of it became clearer the longer she stayed grounded in her reality. It hadn't just been beautiful, it had been too beautiful, too neat, too controlled. And the deeper horror was realizing that she had nearly surrendered everything for it. The next few days were a blur of fatigue and introspection. Clara didn't sleep much, and when she did, her dreams were static-ridden. Half images of the mirror world crashing into flashes of her actual past. She walked the halls of the inn like a ghost herself, touching the old photographs, running her fingers along the dusty bookshelves, reading and rereading Mabel's journal. New entries appeared now, or perhaps old ones she hadn't noticed before. One in particular stood out. The mirror offers not what you want, but what you mourn. And it will keep you mourning so long as you stay. Even love becomes a leash if it keeps you from growing. That line haunted her. Had she ever really wanted to return to Julian? Or had she simply longed for the version of herself who had once believed in possibility? She started cleaning. Not in the idle, procrastinating way she used to when overwhelmed, but with purpose. She opened every curtain, washed every window, and threw open every door in the inn to let the sea air in. She removed the dusty sheets from the furniture and scrubbed the floors until her hands ached. There was something ritualistic in the act, an exorcism of silence and fantasy. She even took the mirror down. It fought her subtly. The glass distorted her face in the final moments, showing her a version of herself smiling, wedding ring glittering, baby on her hip. But Clara didn't hesitate. She turned the mirror to the wall. She didn't shatter it. She wasn't angry. But she would no longer let it dictate the terms of her longing. Still the ache remained. Grief for a life unlived is a peculiar pain. It has no name, no closure. Julian had been real once, even if only for a summer. And the mirror world had offered her the fantasy of reconnection, a vision crafted from guilt and nostalgia and loneliness. She missed him, but not the illusion. She missed who she had been when he loved her. Open-hearted, brave, willing to be seen. The problem wasn't that she had stepped into the mirror. The problem was that for too long she had lived beside it, watching, wanting, aching. The trap hadn't been the mirror alone. It had been the part of her that believed she didn't deserve more than a memory. On the 6th morning she found something new in the study. A letter addressed to her, in handwriting she didn't recognize. It was written in ink so faint it seemed to fade as she read it. Dear Clara, if you're reading this, it means you made the hardest choice. The mirror doesn't show the truth. It shows a choice you didn't make. And it tempts you by promising you never have to make another. But you've chosen growth over comfort, pain over delusion. And in doing so, you've begun to live again. Not everyone who enters room 217 ever leaves. But you did. And that means the story isn't over. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks as she folded the letter and placed it in her journal. That evening, she sat at the desk in room 217 and began to write again. About the mirror, the man, the longing, the grief, and the release. It wasn't a story she intended to publish. Not yet. It was for her. A way to make peace with all the versions of herself that had once been scattered like glass shards across memory. She began painting again too. Not visions of the mirror life, but pieces from her childhood. The cliffs beyond the inn, the sea in all its moods. Her art came slow at first but steady, honest. The trap of the perfect life had been seductive because it was frozen, unchanging, sealed in the amber of possibility. But Clara no longer needed perfection. She needed motion, breath, change. One afternoon she caught her reflection in the hall mirror. Not the old one, but a small rectangular thing by the staircase, and paused. She looked tired, but not lost. Her eyes held light again. The faint lines around them were not from grief, but from smiling in the sun. And just behind her, she saw something that made her chest bloom with warmth. A new painting hanging in the study, of a woman walking away from a mirror, her back straight, her hand outstretched toward the sea. Clara turned from the mirror and kept walking. It was nearly dusk when Clara returned to room 217 with one final purpose in mind. The light outside had dimmed to a soft lavender, the horizon bleeding into the sea with that fleeting magic only coastal evenings possess. The inn was quiet again, not because it was empty, but because it was whole. The floors no longer creaked with hesitation. The air no longer hung heavy with tension. Still, room 217 had one last question to ask. Clara stepped inside and faced the mirror she had turned to the wall. She didn't flinch this time, didn't hesitate. She reached forward and slowly turned it back around. The glass was inert, reflecting only her present self. No flicker, no alternate world. For a moment, she let herself believe that it was over, that she had broken the spell. But then the mirror shifted. Not physically but perceptibly. The air rippled like breath on cold glass. The reflection changed, not to Julian, not to the cottage, but to herself, at a crossroads. In the mirror, Clara stood before two doors. One was marked with a symbol she'd seen carved into the frame all along, ivy twined with sea serpents. The other was blank. Behind the ivy-marked door, she could faintly see the world she had left. Julian, the cottage, the scent of rain on the windowsill. Behind the other, nothing but shadow. But the expression on the reflection's face told her everything. This was the final choice. Not between Julian and solitude. Not between fantasy and fact. But between living in a memory, or choosing the unknown. She reached toward the glass. Her fingers stopped just short of touching it. She knew, somehow, that this wasn't a metaphor. That if she pressed her palm to it now, if she opened that ivy door, she would go back. And this time she might not find her way out again. "Julian," she whispered, not knowing if he would hear. "I did love you. I still do." Her reflection nodded as though in understanding. And in that moment, Clara felt a clarity unlike anything she had experienced before. Julian had been real. And what they shared, short though it was real. The mirror had offered her a perfectly preserved version of it, untouched by time, conflict, or growth. But love isn't meant to stay frozen. It's meant to expand, to evolve, to let go when needed. And now so was she. She stepped back from the mirror. The glass didn't resist. It didn't beg. It simply shimmered. And showed her only herself. Just Clara. No alternate life, no vanished roads. Clara with her messy hair, her calloused hands from scrubbing floors, and eyes that had learned to hold both sorrow and strength. And for the first time since she arrived at the inn, she smiled at her own reflection. She turned away from the mirror and walked to the desk. There she placed the photo she had found weeks ago, the one from the art retreat where she and Julian had first met. She had laminated it carefully, added a short note to the back. "Thank you for finding me once. I'll carry you forward." Then she picked up Mabel's journal and wrote her own final entry beneath the last faded line. "The mirror no longer shows me what I mourn. It shows me who I've become." She closed the journal and placed it beside the photo. That night, she gathered firewood from the shed behind the inn and lit a fire in the hearth. She brewed tea. She sat down with her sketchpad and began drawing a new painting, one not from a memory or a vision, but from what she saw outside the window. Seagulls gliding against a storm-lit sky, waves curling like calligraphy. The world in motion. When she returned to room 217 the next morning, the mirror was gone. Not broken. Not stolen. Simply gone. In its place stood an empty frame on the wall. Wooden, intricate, but filled with blank plaster. As if it had fulfilled its purpose and bowed out. Clara stood before it for a long time. Not with longing, but with gratitude. She ran her fingers along the frame and whispered, "Thank you. But I'm writing my own ending now." And she did. Spring arrived gently, as if the world itself had been holding its breath through winter, waiting for Clara to find her footing before unfurling new life. The cliffs around the inn erupted in yellow gorse and violet heather, and the sea sparkled more often than it stormed. The Seafarer's Rest had awakened too, not just as a structure but as a presence. Clara had reopened the inn quietly, without fanfare, inviting artists, writers, and travelers in search of something unspoken. She didn't advertise it as a spiritual place or claim it had magic. But those who stayed often left behind journal entries filled with words like clarity, healing, and release. There were no more mirrors in the rooms. Clara had removed them all. Instead, each room held a painting, a landscape, a seascape, an unfinished horizon, and a small card that read, "What you see matters less than how you see it." Room 217 remained untouched, not sealed off but repurposed. She turned it into a gallery space, filled with her work, pieces from before the mirror, during and after. At the center of the room hung her final mirror-inspired painting, The Uncrossed Threshold. It showed a woman standing before a tall mirror that reflected not her body, but a swirling sky, half sunlight, half storm. People stared at it for long minutes, some weeping without knowing why. Some turned away quickly. But none left unchanged. Clara still thought of Julian, though not with the ache she once carried. It had softened into something tender, like the memory of rain on a roof or the taste of tea from a familiar cup. She didn't try to trace him down in the real world. Part of her wondered if he had ever existed beyond that summer, or if the mirror had simply built him from the bones of her longing. But that didn't matter anymore. Julian had become a symbol, not of regret but of possibility. The version of herself that had loved him was still alive in her, reshaped into strength. Sometimes when she walked the cliffs alone at dusk, she would hear the waves whisper his name, not calling her back, but reminding her that she had once dared to leap. One morning a letter arrived with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, cream-colored, the handwriting familiar. You were never trapped. You were never broken. You were waiting. And you were brave enough to walk through yourself. There was no signature. Just a pressed sprig of rosemary, perfectly preserved. Clara closed the letter slowly and tucked it into the final page of her journal, where the mirror's story ended. That afternoon, she held a small ceremony by the sea, burying the mirror's frame in the sand as the tide began to rise. No speeches, no witnesses, just her, the salt wind, and the soft hush of waves curling inward. She placed a single stone atop the spot, one she had painted with a single word, remember. And she did. But not as a wound, as a gift. The mirror had once reflected her fear, her longing, her grief. But it had also reflected her courage, her refusal to remain frozen, her decision to face herself fully, and still move forward. The woman who had once stepped through the glass searching for love, had returned not empty, but full. Full of herself, her truth, her fire. And no illusion could hold her anymore. In the end, it wasn't the mirror that changed her. It was the act of choosing. Choosing reality. Choosing imperfection. Choosing the untidy, beautiful mess of now. And when new guests asked why room 217 felt different, why the light there seemed softer, the silence somehow richer, Clara only smiled and said, "It's where I remembered who I was." And that was enough. It had been over a year since Clara buried the frame of the mirror beneath the shifting tides, marking the final chapter of a story she thought was complete. Life had settled into a rhythm at the Seafarer's Rest, ebb and flow like the sea itself. Travelers came and went, art bloomed in the studio, laughter returned to the halls. And Clara herself had changed. She laughed more freely. She painted without the weight of expectation. Her days felt rooted, her nights peaceful. But she had also grown into something more than a survivor. She had become a keeper, not of the inn alone, but of the stories too heavy for others to carry. The mirror, though long gone, lived on in the paintings she created, in the quiet she offered others, and in the strength she'd reclaimed. So when she received a package with no return address, wrapped in canvas and tied with a thread of violet ribbon, her first reaction wasn't fear. It was recognition. She brought it inside slowly, hands steady. The weight was familiar, not heavy but dense with meaning. The label read simply, "To the one who remembers without looking back." Inside was a mirror. Not the one she'd buried, but unmistakably related. Molar. Framed in oak instead of walnut. The carvings were new. Wildflowers instead of ivy, stars instead of serpents. This mirror didn't shimmer. It didn't hum. It was still. Silent. Watching. Clara set it on the studio table and stared at it for a long time. Her reflection stared back. Older, wiser, smiling softly. There were no visions. No alternate lives. No hidden doors. Just her exactly as she was. She almost laughed at the simplicity of it. A mirror that finally told the truth. Attached to the ribbon had been a card. Not all mirrors are prisons. Some are invitations. Some are thank yous. That night, she didn't dream of Julian, or of rooms that led nowhere. She dreamed of a house filled with mirrors that showed only light, every room aglow with color and possibility. When she woke, she walked to the studio and placed the mirror on the wall, not with reverence, but with purpose. This one was not to be hidden. It would not tempt or trap. It would be a mirror for others, those who came to the inn to find the parts of themselves they'd lost. She placed a note beneath it. This mirror does not show what might have been. It shows what still can be. Guests came and some stared at it for hours. Others touched the glass and wept. No one saw visions. No one disappeared. But they all left something behind. Brushstrokes on canvas, pages in journals, names in the guest book beside quotes like, "Today I saw myself for the first time. I remembered who I am. I'm ready to begin again." As for Clara, she no longer feared mirrors. She walked past them easily, even joyfully, pausing now and then to nod at the woman within. Not because she needed reassurance, but because she liked what she saw. One day, she added a final entry to Mabel's journal. A note not for herself, but for whoever would inherit the inn someday, long after she was gone. If room 217 ever speaks to you, listen. But do not follow blindly. Mirrors don't define you. You do. And if you ever lose your way, remember this. You were never a reflection. You were always the light. And with that, the story closed. Not in silence, but in radiance. Thank you for diving into our incredible stories. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more adventures. This is just the beginning. There's so much more to come.